Hello, my name's Rob and welcome to Swift Slots, and welcome to part 2 of turning my eBay plastic kit into a slot car. Now if you've watched part 1, you'll have seen that was all about powering up the back end of the car, taking it from a standard kit and getting it more like a slot car with a powered back axle. So in this episode, it's all about the front end, strengthening up the front beam, getting a guide on. So without further ado, let's crack on with the work. So the first step in getting the front end sorted is establishing the ride height of the standard kit as it sits now. So that involves popping these standard kit wheels back on, which will be turned into slot car wheels and tyres in a later video, not this one. So you need to get those on and get the car onto the setup plate. And then we need to find a common denominator on the chassis that is referable to later stages of the build. Now I think that the middle pipe on this downpipe is the point. It's the lowest point of the exhaust and it's the most referable part of the chassis. I was hoping to come off the chassis itself, but there are bars and things in the way. So that third pipe, or that middle pipe, sorry, is it. And this is a 4mm drill. So that 4mm drill fits in there really, really nicely. So now we have got that, I can now take off, or study first of all, this front end and then carefully remove all of the parts on this front axle. And I note that there are some beams coming back here tying into the chassis, which means that I can turn those into brass, which will give me some really nice triangulation on this front beam when it's all into place, and that will give me some really nice structure. So now I know that it's 4mm on the bottom of this middle header. I can now strip the front end away of the chassis very carefully, and then we can start designing the front beam. One other thing I forgot to say was you need to allow for the front guide. So with the front guide in and that post just trimmed down, we can actually get the guide to snuck up underneath this front radiator very, very nicely. There's just enough room. It will poke out just a hair, but that seems to be quite normal on these cars. There's nothing really I can do about it. And I don't want to put this guide behind the back axle because that will make some rather weird handling characteristics, and I don't want that. So it's not going to be too obtrusive, but it just means I have to design a tongue into that front beam to take the guide. So let's crack on with pulling this front end apart. Okay, so that was fairly traumatic. It gave me a lot more trouble than getting the original chassis off the body, but no damages, all came off okay in the end, just a little bit of a struggle. And there is our front beam assembly. So the next job now is to take the essence of this shape and recreate that in a piece of 2mm thick brass that sits back in the original position, sympathetic to where this original piece came from, and terminates at the correct height for these wheel centers. So that's going to involve a little bit of silver soldering and a little bit of bearing making and so on and so forth. And I'm going to do my best to recreate these arms, if not potentially reuse these plastic arms, the steering rods. Once I've silver soldered the bearings in the top and the tongue, I might soft solder these little arms and put this original bar back on. These bars here, these tie bars that come back into the chassis, they will be let into the brass beam, and these will be brass, and they'll be silver soldered into the beam at the same time as the bearings, and these bars then will have little return which will go through the chassis to triangulate this whole section and make it nice and strong. There'll also be some plates on the top of this crossbar here which locate into the chassis, and they'll be fixed in there as well. So let's get on and design this brass cross beam, and then we can get on to cutting it all out. Okay, so that gets the front beam basically built in all its fundamental components with enough meat there to file off where necessary. So these tubes all line up correctly because I put the bar through to keep them all nice and in line. So they're both exactly the same in that regard. The holes will need to be reamed out to take these shouldered screws that will go in there like that. And these are not actually the body screws for slot cars, but they're something remarkably similar. They're off my model helicopter flying days, probably for a control arm, but they're almost identical to the 2mm body float screws that you can buy from Pendle. If you're going to use them for that, I would get the steel ones. And then the whole thing fits up underneath the car exactly like that in the original position, with these tie rods coming back that'll be turned through 90 degrees and come through the chassis. And then as you can see, then there's a little bit of room there to start shaping it all in and making it look nice. And this is what we're dealing with compared to the original. So you can see that my bearings are more or less in exactly the same place as the original, and then I can swoop down these ends, swoop in the middle, and just get some final shaping to it. And I silver soldered all these components together because two reasons. One, they're stress bearing, so they want to be really, really solid. And also it means that I can solder on extra little control arms to the top here for the detail for this steering arm to come across. So I can actually soft solder the bar that coming out of here to pick up this bar on both sides now, because the soft solder won't even come anywhere near touching the silver solder. So I can build up 2 layers of different types of solder without the fear of one melting the other. So let's get this all shaped up and see if we can start getting it to the chassis. Okay, so this is where we're at the moment. I'll leave it like this for a second just to demonstrate what I've done. So I've filed the bottom of this cross beam so that it rises up inside the chassis, and I've used drills to keep packing up the front of the car until this 4mm drill slides neatly underneath that middle header. There's about 0.2 of a mil gap, but it's basically there. And this axle here at 1.9mm is just so that I can sight the height of the center line of this axle, which has to be 12.5mm. So where I am at the moment is that axle is now 12.5mm to its center, more or less. This 4mm drill fits underneath that middle down pipe reasonably well, very well, with a tiny little bit of gap. And this front drill here is holding everything up where it needs to be relatively. So I'll take it apart now and show you what I've done. So there you are. All I've done is kept filing this beam down and down and down to lift this beam up into the chassis, making sure that it touches neatly and it just fits inside there like that perfectly. So that is now pretty much the exact height of the front of that axle. I'm very happy with that. That'll work. So now what I've got to do is shape in all this end pieces here to make it look neat and try and get it to look something vaguely to what we've got there. Now I can't copy this shape exactly because I put the bearings on the top, so I am going to have to take a little bit of license with the shape of it, but that's just modeling for you because I've got various constraints and I can't make, unless I made this as an actual proper beam, which wouldn't be as strong as this bar, I'm not going to get that shape because these pieces here go into the center of the wheel, so that's like a swan neck. Now I can't get a swan neck in there because I've actually used a different type of bearing, so my axle now has to go in there dead straight like that, which is not how this original beam was set up. But I can make this look reasonably attractive with a bit of a concave. So we'll do that now. We'll get a nice shaping on here and then we'll think about refitting it into the car and seeing where we are at that point. Okay, so where we're at the moment is I've made up these two 0.5mm nickel silver chassis plates that run down each side, and they're super glued and joggled in here and here because the plastic chassis got a joggle in it anyway, so that keeps it all nice and tight. This chassis fits incredibly nicely into the body of the car. If I just ease him in like that, so it all fits in there nice and tight, and it looks great from the side, but you'll all get painted black anyway. Doesn't add any extra thickness to the side rails, but it adds a great deal of stability. That's really solid in there now. I'm very comfortable that that will hold the power of the car. Plus they run all the way back to here, so there's loads of supported material. So with the chassis rails in place and glued, the chassis rails will need to be pinned as well, because glue alone won't hold it. So there'll be this 1.2 wire. I'll go through here, out through the plastic. I'll soft solder it on the outside and it'll be glued on the inside. And there'll be another one through the side here that'll come out inside that engine mount. And when this beam goes into place, these return rods will be turned through 90 degrees and go through. So the side rails will be pinned into 3 places. The next thing I need to work out as well is the tongue assembly to hold the guide. So there's going to be a plate on the front and a plate on the back, and they'll come together to form 2 and soft solder, and the whole thing will come off there and all hold the guide. Also, I need to ream these bearings out so that this screw will actually go into there and turn very freely. And to do that, I'm going to use a brooch, a tapered brooch. So see, there's lots of different sizes here, but I've chosen the size that I want and put it in a tap holder. And all that does is goes into the hole, and you just gently ream it out like that until the screw is a perfect fit inside that bearing, and it's very, very free to turn. So that just takes a little bit more work. Is spot on. It's free to turn on its shank. Yeah, there's no movement in that thread at all, so that wheel will be very nicely supported. So now I've done that, I can get the other side on, work out where my tongue is going to go, get that all soldered on, and then start buttoning all this lot up together. And once all that lot is done, I can then do some fine detail around the outside, and it's ready to paint. There we are. That gets the guide holder all made up, and after it's reaming, that's a very nice fit in there with no wobble and a good amount of lock, and then that clips into the front beam like that. So all I need to do now is offer it to the front of the car, adjust the height of that bush, make sure that my guide holder is in the right place on the front beam, and I can solder the front guide holder to the front beam and then move on to the next stage. So there we are, with the car's trainer wheels all made. That enabled me to set up this whole front end and get the guide mount all soldered into place. So the last jobs to do are make a couple of little brackets here and here to solder in the front beam, button up a few other small details and get it into paint. So let's do that. So I'm making all this really small detail off camera because it's really hard to record. But all this is a little 0.5mm nickel silver angle bracket, and it'll just fit up inside there to solder the front cross beam to the chassis rail. And I'll just sit in there like that. Right, let's get on and solder it in. And that seems to be it. I appear to have managed to get the front end all put back together again and looking pretty acceptable. I don't think the characteristic of the car has been lost in any meaningful way. I think we've got all the detail back in there that's needed and all looking pretty neat. As you can see, I threaded the wires up down the side of this bulkhead here and between the door skin, through the back of the motor or the engine, through the engine itself and out through the front of the oil pan, and the wires are here all ready to come through onto the front guide when I get to that point. There's no point in actually putting the front guide together yet because I have to get the front wheels all sorted out in the next video. So we'll save the wiring up of the guide and the setting up of the guide until then. But as you can see, I've got the tie rods all in, tied through to the chassis. I've got the shock absorbers on, the little bit of detail, and I've also got the steering arm cross. In reality, the steering rod was probably supposed to have gone onto the underside of these bars, but just because it's very fine detail, there's a lot of strength when it's wedged between the chassis and this rail here. So I've put it there just because it's stronger and more durable. And this is a slot car at the end of the day. It could get grabbed or it could get caught. So I think up and out the way is the better option. So that's that. The radiator is still loose at the moment because I need to get to the screw to adjust for the guide. But once the guide is adjusted and the braids are all in, this post here, put a little spot of glue on that and I can put the grill down. I don't, to be honest, expect to have to go into the front end too much and adjust too much on a regular basis. So a little spot of glue on that post there to hold the front grill into place will be more than good enough. So there we are. I hope you'd agree that I haven't done too much damage to the front of this car, and it still keeps all of its essence. So in the next video, I shall be turning these wheels into slot car wheels. And in first impression, I think these front wheels will work perfectly well as is. Just make a hub on the back, and that will get the front end sorted out. And the back ones are going to try and retain this white wall as part of the wheel, and the rubber will be separate. So they'll take a little bit of modifying to get those done. But they say that's in the next video. Oh, just before I disappear, I'll just show you the car under its own power. And I've only got a little 3-volt battery here because that's all I've got to hand. But 3 volts is good, better than nothing. So there he is there, all working fine. So that'll bring me to the end of this video. In the next video, like I say, we'll get all the wheels all sorted out, tyres, and we'll get this car completely finished, and then we'll hit the track and actually give it some laps. So until the next time, thank you. So, if you've enjoyed this content, maybe you'll subscribe, and if you hit the little bell button, that'd be awesome. So until the next time, thank you very much.